If you have ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you're going to start your own podcast or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. Both links will be in the episode description if you are interested. You probably have heard someone at least once say, "Everyone grieves in their own way." While I feel that statement is very true, I also feel that while we don't grieve the same, we do grieve similarly. Most of us go through the 5 stages of grief when we lose someone we love: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. We might not go through the 5 stages of grief in that exact order, but generally that is what grief looks like. Now, each one of those stages looks different for each person. For one person, depression might look like a person sitting front row at a funeral with an endless stream of tears pouring from their eyes, while for another, it looks like sitting alone in a room blankly staring at nothing. Anger may look like a person screaming at the sky, cursing at the higher power they believe in, while for another, it might look like making a vow to seek revenge and leaving a path of death and destruction in their wake. Ahoy! My name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the first episode of the 3rd season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. 'Tis season 3 of History Shelf, and I have titled this season, Yo Ho, A Pirate's Life for Me. In this season, it be all about pirates. The pirates and scallywags that sailed the 7 seas and some rivers, looking for booty as they made their travels. Some of these pirates came from humble beginnings, while others surprisingly came from well-to-do families. But no matter where or who they came from, they all had one thing in common. They be pirates. And for this week, I am talking about Jeanne de Clisson. Before I get started on Jeanne's story, I just wanted to let you know that I will not be talking like a pirate for the entire episode. I just wanted to do something fun for the introduction to kick off season 3. I think if I talked like a pirate for the entire episode, I would get on your nerves and also mine. Also, if you are a return listener, welcome back. If you are new, well, welcome to History Shelf. If you are new and you're thinking, okay, this is season 3, so I need to stop this episode and go back and listen to the first 2 seasons first, well, you can do that, but that's not necessary because each season has a different theme and each episode is about someone new. So if you want to stop this episode and listen to the episodes in chronological order, that's something you can do. Or you can finish this episode and then go back to the previous episodes. Or if you're just listening to this episode because you find this person to be interesting and you want to learn more about her and then you never want to listen to another episode of this podcast ever again, that's also something you can do. You do you. Alright, now let's get started on Jeanne's story. Jeanne de Clisson was also known as Jeanne de Belleville and the Lioness of Brittany. Well, English sources referred to her as the Lioness of Brittany, but French sources referred to her as the Tigress of Brittany. It's unclear how or why the English got that wrong. Jeanne was born in 1300 in Belleville-sur-Vie in the Duchy of Brittany. At the time, Brittany was a self-governing entity in what is now Western France. Belleville was a former commune. Yes, this episode is heavily going to be placed in the France area, so that means there is going to be a lot of French names that I am going to have to pronounce. If you are not new to this podcast, then you know my French is not the greatest. I am sure I have already pronounced something wrong this episode, but I am going to try to get these pronunciations right. But I'm sure my French-speaking listeners will be cringing multiple times in this episode. Jeanne was beautiful. She had reddish-brown hair and pale skin. Jeanne's father was a nobleman named Maurice IV Montague of Belleville and Pellew, and her mother was Lettice de Parthenay. The only sibling I found that Jeanne had was an older half-brother named Maurice V Montague. Maurice No. 5 was a child from Jeanne's father's first marriage. In 1312, when Jeanne was just 12 years old, she married a 19-year-old widower named Geoffrey de Chateaubriand VIII. Centuries ago, people married much younger, but even for Jeanne's time, being married at 12 years old was considered being married young. Geoffrey was a Breton nobleman. Together, Jeanne and Geoffrey had 2 children. Their first one was a son named Geoffrey IX, and he was born in 1314. Their second child came 2 years later in 1316. It was a daughter named Louise. In around 1320, Jeanne's half-brother died. Jeanne inherited the seigneury of Montague and Belleville from him because he had no heirs. A seigneury is a feudal lordship. In 1326, her husband died, making her a widow at the age of 26. She married again. Her second husband was Jeanne de Clisson. This was not a love match. Jeanne married him in 1328. She was 28 years old and he was 41. She married him so she and her children would be provided for. This marriage didn't last long, though, because another family wanted Jeanne to marry their daughter. The Blois family wanted Jeanne to marry their daughter Marie. So the Blois family complained to bishops, and there was an investigation on February 10th, 1330, and the investigation ended with Jeanne's marriage being annulled by Pope John the 22nd. Apparently, their marriage was sexless, and that was why it was able to be annulled, but it was very scandalous. Jeanne didn't marry Marie, though, because he died before the wedding. Later that year, Jeanne married another widower, Olivier IV de Clisson. He was very wealthy. He had lands, a manor house, and he even had a castle. Olivier had a son named Jean with his first wife. Together, Jeanne and Olivier had 5 children. They had a daughter that was named Isabeau. She was born in 1331. Jeanne and Olivier's son Maurice was born in 1333. Their son Olivier V was born in 1336, and their son Guillaume was born in 1338. And their last child, their daughter Jeanne, was born in 1340. Her son Maurice died in 1334. Both Jeanne and Olivier were powerful before they married each other. When they got together, that just made them even more powerful. Think of them as the Beyoncé and Jay-Z of their time. They were the senior lord in the border of the region of Brittany. This marriage was different from her first 2 marriages. This marriage was a happy and loving union. Even though Jeanne and Olivier was a love match, she still took him to court to ensure that she and her children got what was agreed upon in her marriage contract. And not only did she take her husband to court, but King Philip VI ruled in her favor. Now, if you are thinking to yourself, I thought this season was all about pirates. When are we going to get to the, pirate stuff? This season is all about pirates, and we will be getting to the pirate stuff soon. I promise. But before we get to the pirate stuff, you first have to know about the War of the Britain Succession. The War of Britain Succession was fought between 1341 and April 12, 1365. This was also known as the War of the Two Jeannes, because the two rival duchesses involved in the war were both named Jeanne. Here's what you need to know about the war. It was between the Counts of Bleuol and the Montforts of Brittany. They were fighting over the Duchy of Brittany. France supported the Bleuols, which was the same family that had Jeanne's second marriage annulled, and England supported the Montforts. This war was a proxy of the 100 Years' War. The Duke of Brittany, Duke Arthur II of Dreux, was married twice. From his first marriage to Mary of Limoges, he had 3 sons, including his heir John III. Then he married Yolande of Dreux, and he had a son, and apparently he really liked the name John because he named his son that he had with Yolande also John. To avoid confusion, I will call John number 2 Montfort because that was what he was the count of. And I will call the first John just John. John hated his half-siblings. He hated them so much that he tried and failed to have the marriage between his father and his stepmother annulled, which, had he been successful, that would have meant that his half-siblings would have been declared illegitimate. John didn't have any children, and he had outlived both of his whole brothers. So that should have meant that his heir was his half-brother Montfort, but like I said, he hated him. So instead, he made his niece, Jeanne de Penthièvre, which was Jeanne's ex-stepdaughter from her second marriage. Jeanne de Penthièvre was also known as Joan of Penthièvre, so I will be calling her Joan for the remainder of the story because there is just too many Jeannes in this story. So John passing Montfort over for his niece Joan, of course, started a war. Joan's husband was Charles de Bleuol, and that is who Jeanne's husband, Olivier, sided with. So he sided with the French side of the conflict. In 1342, Olivier was defending the city of Vannes when he was captured by England. But he wasn't held prisoner for long. He was released for an exchange for Ralph de Stafford, the first Earl of Stafford, and also a low ransom. This exchange surprised some because it was not an equal exchange, but it wasn't completely out of the norm. There were other exchanges like this later on in the war, but because this was not an equal exchange, it made Charles de Bleuol believe that Olivier was a traitor and he was secretly siding with the English, and he did not defend Vannes to the best of his ability, and so he let the English take the city. Both France and England signed the Truce of Maritois on January 19, 1343. There was a tournament that was put together to celebrate the peace between the two countries. Olivier and 15 other Breton nobles were invited. This invite was actually a trap. On their way to the tournament, the nobles were arrested. Olivier and the rest of the nobles were put on trial. Jeanne desperately tried to get her husband out of prison. She tried to bribe a sergeant of the guard to get her husband out. That guard was arrested for delaying Olivier's execution. On March 12, 1343, the guard was released from parole. The next day, March 13, 1343, Olivier was moved to a more secure prison. So obviously they thought that Jeanne would try to get her husband out again. On March 19, 1343, Jeanne was summoned because she was being charged with having conspired to have rebellions, disobediences, and excesses against the king, public welfare, and the king's royal majesty. So she was being charged with treason. This enraged Jeanne. Up until that point, Jeanne had done nothing that would have made anyone rightfully call her a rebel. Jeanne was not arrested because she was able to avoid arrest because she was protected by her stepson, Jean. Jeanne was summoned to go to Paris by King Philip VI in June of 1343. Jeanne ignored the summons. Jeanne was found guilty, even though she was not there. On August 2nd, 1343, Olivier IV was executed for treason. He was beheaded and his head was put on a spike in Nantes. This was shocking. It was shocking that he was executed because there really wasn't any evidence to prove that he was guilty. The only evidence that they had was an alleged confession Olivier made in private. There isn't even proof that his confession actually existed, but even if it did, I have covered enough false confessions on this podcast to prove that confessions are not really evidence of guilt. It was also shocking that his head was put on display on a pike, because that treatment was only for low-class criminals. Because of the charges against Jeanne that I mentioned earlier, and also being charged for her attempt to bribe her husband out of prison, Jeanne was sentenced to banishment, and she lost a lot of her property. So her property that was in land that was under French control went to the French crown. Jeanne took two of her children, her sons Olivier V and Guillaume, to go see the head of their father. I don't know why she thought it was a good idea to show her sons, who were 7 and 5 respectively at the time, to go see their father's head on a spike. Legend has it that she did this because after they saw his head, she made them both swear that they would seek revenge for their father. Jeanne was determined to make France pay. First, Jeanne sold off valuables like land, jewelry, furniture, and by some accounts, she even prostituted herself to acquire the money to get her revenge. Jeanne gathered an army. This army was filled with her friends and members of the families of the other nobles that King Philip VI unjustly executed. With Jeanne, there is a lot of legend that surrounds her. So much that it is a little difficult to determine fact from fiction, but there is enough evidence to know that the bones of this story are correct. But some of the details might be, let's say, embellishments. Jeanne raised an army of about 400 men and channeled her inner Taylor Swift, long before Taylor existed, and went on her vigilante shit. Jeanne turned her grief into a rampage. After the execution of the noblemen by King Philip VI, the treaty that ended the War of Britain's Succession was forgotten and the war resumed. Jeanne gave her support to Montfort. Jeanne raided and captured many castles. One of the castles that she attacked was a former post that was under her husband Olivier's control. It was under the command of Gaulois de la Huse. Gaulois was an officer of Charles de Blois. Gaulois recognized Jeanne and told his men to let her in. This was a huge mistake. Her and her army slaughtered the men. Philip sent men to reclaim the castle, but by the time that they got there, she was long gone. Whenever Jeanne would attack a castle, she would leave one man alive, so they could tell the story of what she had done. Soon she took this act to the sea, where she became, wait for it, a pirate. Jeanne would attack unsuspecting French ships. If you were French, you were a target. She would attack them from the fog without warning. When she got on board, she would randomly point at one man, and that would be the one that would get to live to tell the tale of her terror she was spreading. She would then personally behead all of the noblemen that were on board the ship. She would then throw the bodies of the men overboard. Then she would go down below and raid the ship. Jeanne quickly became a force. Many, rightfully so, were terrified of her. No one wanted to sail and take the risk of crossing paths with her. So in 1345, King Philip VI sent soldiers after her. They found her and raided her ship and killed her forces. Jeanne and her children barely escaped with their lives, but they did escape. Many probably would have given up after that, but Jeanne had not yet satisfied her thirst for revenge. So she rowed away from her ship towards England. She rowed for 5 days and 5 nights. She didn't even stop when her youngest son, Guillaume, got sick from being exposed to the elements and died. When she got to England, she met with the king, King Edward III. With the help of England, she was able to purchase 3 warships. The ships were painted black with red sails. Her enemies called her fleet the Black Fleet. Her flagship was named My Revenge, and revenge is what she continuously sought after. Jeanne possibly became a privateer for England. There is no evidence to definitively say that she indeed was a privateer for England, but this is a good time to tell you the difference between a pirate and a privateer, because it's going to come up a few times this season. A few people that I cover this season, either they started off as a pirate and they became a privateer, or they started off as a privateer and they became a pirate. So the difference between the two is that a privateer has a license to be a pirate and a pirate does not. So every privateer is a pirate, but not every pirate is a privateer. Jeanne started attacking French ships in the Bay of Biscay. She had no problem capturing these ships because merchant ships were no match for warships. And she continued on with leaving one person to tell what happened. And she would then take anything of value and then go on to the next ship. This is when she became known as the Tigress of Brittany, which has now turned into the Lioness of Brittany. In 1346, Jeanne helped out the English in the Cressy Campaign. The Cressy Campaign was part of the 100 Years' War. The Cressy Campaign devastated the French countryside at the hands of the English. This was when England captured Calais from the French. Of course, if you listen to the episode I did on Queen Mary Tudor I of England in the first season of this podcast, then you know how France got Calais back, but that wouldn't happen for another 2 centuries. So let's get back to the 14th century. During all her raiding and killing, Jeanne met a man named Sir Walter Bentley. Walter was a commander in King Edward III's army. Walter became Jeanne's 4th husband. In 1349, a man by the name Raoul de Carrel, one of King Edward III's lieutenants, had gained control of many of Jeanne's properties from France. Edward had ordered the properties be returned to Walter. I say returned to Walter because by this point Jeanne and Walter were married, so her properties were her husband's. But when England signed a treaty with Jeanne's enemy, despite Jeanne helping England, Edward turned against her and ordered that Walter give Jeanne's castles to Charles de Blois, the same Charles de Blois that had suspected Jeanne's husband of treason. Walter refused and went to London, England to plead his case. There in London, Walter was put in the Tower of London, but he was eventually released. In January of 1357, Jeanne and Walter were given the barony of the Roche-Maison as compensation. On August 22nd, 1350, King Philip VI died, but that did not end Jeanne's revenge tour. 13 years after Jeanne started her pirate career, she stopped. There is no explanation why she stopped when she did, but I think it is interesting to note that she was a pirate for 13 years and she was also married to Olivier for 13 years. Now, there is no proof that she decided to wreak havoc on the French for 13 years because that is how long she was married to her third husband, but a part of me doesn't want to say that that had to just be a coincidence. After she stopped seeking revenge, she settled into married life with Walter. They settled at the castle of Hennebont. This was a port city on the coast of Brittany. This area was in Montfort territory. Nothing much more is really written about Jeanne. Of course, I don't really know what could be more eventful than becoming a pirate for 13 years to avenge your husband. In December of 1359, Jeanne's fourth husband, Walter, died. A few weeks after Walter died, Jeanne also died. She was 59 years old. Emile Pouant wrote a novel in 1868 titled Jeanne de Belleville, and it was published in France. There are many details in the novel that are similar to Jeanne's story. On September 24, 1999, the City Council of Nantes named a street after Jeanne, and some have said that Jeanne's and Olivier's ghosts haunt the Chateau de Clisson. And that was the life of Jeanne de Clisson. Thank you so much for listening to the first episode of the third season of History Shelf. There are 15 episodes planned for this season. Next week's episode is going to be about Eric of Pomerania. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the Twitter is at History Shelf Pod. The Instagram is at History_Shelf_Pod. The Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. And the TikTok is History Shelf. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store. You can also become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will send out a thank you to you on social media. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month, and with that you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month, and with that you get the first 2 tiers, plus you will get a handwritten note of thanks mailed to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month, and with that you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. Also, if you want to take out some ad space on this podcast, you can. So if you have a podcast or a YouTube channel or a book or a product or anything that you want to advertise, you can on this podcast. I have a gig on Fiverr. You can also click on one of the affiliated links. There's one for Riverside and there's one for Amazon. If you click on one of those links and you buy something, that also helps out the podcast financially. But if you don't want any of the merch and you don't want any of the perks and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help out this podcast financially, I have turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The link to all of the merch and Patreon and Fiverr and the affiliated links All of that is in the episode description for this episode. But as always, the best way that you can support this podcast is to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways that you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast with your friends and family on social media would also help out this podcast a great deal. One more thing before we go. I know a lot of you listen to this podcast on Stitcher, and I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but come August 29th, Stitcher is shutting down. So August 29th, 2023, Stitcher will be no more. So you will have to find another platform to listen to all of your podcasts. All right, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.